Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. George Orwell said, "Doublethink means the power of holding two contradictory beliefs in one's mind simultaneously and accepting both of them." In a minute, I'm going to show you how the New York Times does that, but first a word from our sponsor. We're having the coldest October afternoon on record here in Boulder, Colorado. At 2 p.m. it's 11.5 degrees Fahrenheit and falling. The previous coldest October afternoon here in Boulder was 21 degrees on Halloween Day 2002. Temperatures this afternoon are 10 degrees below the previous October record and 48 degrees below normal. This would be an extremely cold day for January, much less October. And yesterday, Utah set the October record for cold for the United States. It was minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit just east of Logan, Utah. That record is expected to be broken on Wednesday. CO2 seems to be having some difficulty trapping heat here right now. Now let's move on to doublethink at the New York Times. By taking diametrically opposed positions on climate, they can claim to be right no matter what happens. Here's a climate story they published this year. One 2009 study found that the United States saw roughly as many record highs as lows in the 1950s, but by the 2000s there were twice as many record highs as record lows. Severe cold snaps were still happening, but they were becoming less common. Now let's look at the next paragraph. Some recent cold spells have been caused by a dreaded weather system called the polar vortex. There's growing evidence to suggest that the polar vortex is appearing outside the Arctic more frequently because of changes in the jet stream that are attributed to the warming atmosphere. These changes help frigid air escape from the Arctic and swoop southward. So in the first paragraph, they said that cold snaps were happening less frequently, and by implication, it was due to global warming. And in the second paragraph, they said that cold snaps were happening more frequently, and it was also due to global warming. That's a classic case of doublethink. They presented the idea that global warming causes fewer cold snaps, and that global warming also causes more cold snaps. But that's not the only doublethink going on here. In 1978, the New York Times claimed that the polar vortex was due to global cooling rather than global warming like they claim now. So the polar vortex used to be caused by global cooling, but now it's caused by global warming. The New York Times can explain all winter weather via global cooling, global warming, more cold days, or less cold days. The New York Times editors appear to have no problem with all of these contradictory beliefs. The New York Times is exactly what George Orwell warned us about in his novel 1984. Now let's read the first paragraph again. One 2009 study found that the United States saw roughly as many record highs as lows in the 1950s, but by the 2000s there were twice as many record highs as record lows. The United States has excellent records going back to the 19th century. So why did the New York Times pick the 1950s for their start date? Well, let's have a look at that. This graph shows for the past century the ratio of record daily minimums to maximums at all U.S. historical climatology network stations with at least 100 years of data. You can see that the pattern is cyclical. During the 1930s, there were very few record minimums and a lot of record maximums. Then during the 1970s, we got a lot more record minimums than record maximums, and now we've gone back to the 1930s pattern again. There's no long-term trend here, it's just a cycle. But by starting their graph in the 1950s, they can make it look like it's a downwards trend. They've hidden all of the inconvenient data prior to the 1950s, which ruins their story. What we're seeing is the classic fraud which climate alarmists commit over and over and over again. They simply cherry-picked a local maximum to start their downwards trend. This is not climate, this is not science, it's nothing but propaganda. Now, instead of looking at ratios, let's look at the actual numbers of record highs and record lows over the past century. The red area represents record highs, which have declined since the 1930s. And the blue area represents record lows, which have declined since the 1910s. So the number of record highs and record lows are both declining. For some reason, the New York Times forgot to mention that. The very last thing they want their readers to hear is that the U.S. climate is becoming less extreme. Now let's look at the overall temperature trends in the United States. This graph shows the average daily maximum temperature at all United States historical climatology network stations. As you can see, afternoon temperatures in the United States have plummeted over the past century. Meanwhile, nighttime temperatures in the United States have increased, particularly since the mid-1970s. Now we're looking at the average daily U.S. temperature. You can see that it's cyclical. The long-term trend is slightly downwards, but really what's just going on is that we have a cycle. It went up in the 1930s, went down in the 1970s, and has gone up again since the 1970s. There's no indication of climate change here. This is strictly a cyclical weather pattern. However, this next graph does show something changing with the U.S. temperature record. This is the average daily U.S. temperature range, or the difference between daytime temperatures and nighttime temperatures. 100 years ago, the United States used to take much larger swings in temperature between daytime and nighttime, but over the past century, that has declined sharply. Afternoons aren't as hot as they used to be, and evenings aren't as cold as they used to be. This is probably due to the fact that the United States has gotten wetter. Deserts take large daily swings in temperature, whereas more humid climates tend to make smaller swings. So as the U.S. has gotten wetter and greener over the past century, we're taking smaller swings in temperature from day to night. This is the exact opposite of the extreme temperature dialogue which climate alarmists are trying to push on the public. However, there is some indication that we may be seeing more record cold air, like today in the West. Last winter, Montana had one of the coldest spells on record in the United States. Illinois set their all-time cold temperature record in January of this year. And Arizona had their snowiest day on record in February of this year. There's clearly something going on. The last week of December 2017 and the first week of January 2018 were the coldest on record in the eastern United States. I took this picture of people ice skating on the reflecting pool in Washington, D.C. on January 8, 2018. And this is a picture I took on March 7, 2015, taking the dogs for a hike on frozen Chesapeake Bay. I was told by Washington weather expert Andy Weiss that this was probably the first time Chesapeake Bay has been frozen in March since the 18th century. Another indicator is Great Lakes ice cover, which has been very high in 3 of the last 6 years. Now let's head back to New York and focus on the New York Times again. 6 of the 10 largest snowstorms in New York history have occurred since the year 2003. This chart is from the National Weather Service, and they show large snowstorms in 2003, 2006, 2 in 2010, 1 in 2011, and 1 in 2016, their largest storm. Now let's look at how the New York Times has reported on snow and cold. In 1976, they said that very little snow fell during the last ice age. This implies that cold weather means little snow. Then after the blizzard of 1996, they blamed it on global warming. But 10 years later, in 2006, the New York Times announced the endless summer. And in 2007, they announced that skiing was being destroyed by global warming. But in 2010, they reversed their story and said that global warming was going to make it very cold and snowy. If you remember, 2 of their 10 largest snowstorms occurred that year. But 2 years later, the New York Times is back to declaring the endless summer. And by 2014, the New York Times had announced the end of snow. Then in 2016, New York had their largest snowstorm on record. And by this year, they're back blaming cold and snow on global warming and saying it's going to occur more often. So it should be pretty clear by now that the New York Times is an incoherent mess. They simply make up fake climate stories which correspond to the most recent weather. The New York Times is exactly what George Orwell warned us about in his novel 1984. They're not a legitimate news organization. They're simply polluting the minds of their readers with propaganda. There's heavy snowfall and record cold on the other side of my window, but I'm able to make this video comfortably because of the miracle of natural gas. Natural gas is being fracked all over northern Colorado, and it's providing the electricity and heat which is keeping me comfortable right now. The New York Times is pushing a dangerous agenda to shut down fossil fuels, and it's backed by incoherent propaganda. They need to be exposed and ignored by the intelligent, insane people of the world. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time.